So I'm Nancy Guerra, the Dean of the School of Social Ecology, and I wanted to welcome you all here today. And I have nice patent notes to read from, but I never usually do. I try to say really what I feel and what I think is important rather than just reading a script, although thank you to our team for the script. I do want to acknowledge our change makers, and I want to acknowledge our team of Doug Colby and the advancement of the communications team. They've done a wonderful job with this. When they actually first mentioned the idea of doing these Daybreak dialogues at 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, I said, that'll never work. Who gets up that early? So I'm the first to admit that I'm wrong. And it's been a great series. We've had wonderful faculty speakers. It gives us an opportunity to showcase our faculty, and next year we have a great slate, so to kind of keep us in mind for these events. And I want to say, the other thing I want to say is that, and we have Val Janis, the former dean here, sometimes as dean, you wonder, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Why am I working 80 hours a week at all hours of the day? And then I'm reminded that it's events like this, and it's being able to support the research of faculty like Keramet and others that really makes it also rewarding. A student actually came to me yesterday and thanked me for allowing a professor to teach a class because he was so fabulous. That was Paul Piff. And it was like, wow. So there's so much that's rewarding about what we do what I do as the dean, but what we do in our school, because our school really is unique in its commitment to social justice and its commitment to solving important social environmental problems. And I mean that from the heart. I find that academia is really a privilege. We have great positions, and we really can manage knowledge. We create knowledge, we manage knowledge, and what better use of knowledge than to promote our common humanity and promote social justice? And so we have so many faculty in our school who focus on prison reform and all of the injustices in our justice system. We can call it our injustice system, honestly, in so many ways. And I've learned a lot. I've myself done work in the juvenile justice system, and I was always just appalled. I used to work in the California Youth Authority, and when I would go in, I'd spend a day there. I'd have to go to the mall after because it was so depressing that, everything, I just have to go and just, no, but I'd have to see cheerful things and lights, and because I would be so depressed to see everything gray and cement and just, children referred to as wards and meals referred to as feedings. And it was like we treat people like cattle. And I think by way of introducing, Keramet has done amazing work in really opening our eyes to solitary confinement and to some of the really extreme issues in prisons. And I had no clue that solitary, as a person not working in that area, I thought of solitary confinement as that's reserved for a few people who do really horrible things in prisons, and that's not true. And so what we've learned from her is really changing the world. It's changing policy, and she's amazing in the work that she does. She's amazing. I won't, I could go on and on about all of her credentials and the universities she's been at, from Harvard to John Jay to Berkeley. Wonderful places and multiple awards from the American Society of Criminology. But I think the most important thing is that she connects her heart to what she does, and she's doing something that really does make a difference in people's lives. So with that, I present you our wonderful Keramet Reiter. And I didn't read a word.
That was so sweet. I hope I live up to expectations. But I'm really glad to be here. And I want to say before I start, I'm really happy to take questions. I want to give you kind of an overview of recent events around prison reform in California and the nation. And so if there's things you're more interested in or I go too fast, just, I don't mind being interrupted. So I want to start actually by just giving you a little background about my own work in and around prisons to give you some context about where I'm coming from. And I actually got started in prisons as an educator. I started volunteering in prisons when I was in college because I like teaching, and there was a program at my university in Boston, and it seemed like an interesting thing to do. And I went in, and I kind of my heart really never left. I was just fascinated and disturbed by what I saw, and I kept studying these issues and working on these issues. I've taught in prisons in Boston, New York, California. When I was in graduate school, I taught at San Quentin in Northern California. At the time, it was the only face-to-face college program in the state of California when I was teaching there about 10 years ago. And so it was an associate's degree program. These were prisoners in a classroom who were earning that AA degree in prison. The reason it was the only face-to-face program in California was completely volunteer-run by graduate students and faculty at Berkeley. Because there was no funding up until very recently for higher education in prison. In 1996, the federal government cut Pell grants for prisoners. So there were very few programs over the last few years. So that's one program in California in 2012. And my other big, as the dean mentioned, my other big research project for the last 10 years has been studying the uses of long-term solitary confinement. So in 2016, I published the book 23/7, which is at its core a history of Pelican Bay State Prison. Great, good. When I started studying Pelican Bay 10, 12 years ago, I wouldn't get that audience. So this is actually part of the change I want to talk about, right? That people have heard of these institutions. That's a really important piece of the kinds of change I'm interested in. So anyway, I wrote this history. Pelican Bay is one of the archetypal supermaxes. It opened in 1989, and a lot of the subsequent prisons built in the 90s to be high security facilities were modeled on Pelican Bay. Pelican Bay had 1,056 beds. Oh, did I not turn my speaker on? Hear me better now? In the back? Good. Thank you. Put up your hand if you can. I'm usually kind of loud, but okay, so Pelican Bay had 1,056 beds designed for long-term isolation. When I say long-term isolation, I don't mean a few weeks or a few months. I mean years and sometimes decades at a time. Prisoners locked alone in a cell the size of a wheelchair-accessible bathroom stall. No natural light, no access to human contact. So that's what I was interested in this book. Why did these prisons get designed? How were they being used? And at the time I wrote the book, there were around 4,000 people in those kinds of conditions in long-term solitary confinement around the state of California. So that's kind of the status quo just 2 years ago. One college education program in prison, more than 4,000 people in solitary confinement for years at a time, in California alone. And in this way, California is fairly representative of the nation. There were very few college programs across the country, and there are debates about how many people, but estimates are upwards of 100,000 in long-term solitary confinement across the US. Now, just to sort of drive this home with some images, when you Googled California prisons, I want to show you some of the things you would see a few years ago. Also, incidentally, you used to see these things if you Googled my first name. Less true now, thankfully. Trying to dissociate a little from these depressing images. So this is a picture of a cell at Pelican Bay State Prison, one of these isolation cells. You can see kind of stark, poured concrete, just one solid piece. What you see there is just the bunk bed with a thin foam mattress, a steel toilet sink combination you can kind of see in the corner. That's where people are spending their time. The name of my book, 23/7, right? 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. Usually, maybe twice a week, prisoners would be allowed out for an hour or two into an exercise yard, not much bigger than this cell, often colloquially called a dog run, to kind of describe the harshness of the conditions. So that's a cell at Pelican Bay. That's the inside, that's a corridor that these cells are kind of off of pods. You can see someone looking down, kind of depressing look there. The other thing you would Google when you saw California prisons often were these images of just grossly overcrowded facilities. So these are pictures of prisoners in makeshift gyms and social spaces with bunk beds stacked 3 high because the prisons were operating at 167% of capacity. When the Supreme Court heard a case about this, they noted that 1 prisoner a week was dying unnecessarily because of the inadequate health care in the state prison system connected to this overcrowding. And then one of my favorite, California calls them therapeutic treatment modules. It's a little bit of a euphemism for the cages that prisoners, when they're in solitary confinement, are put in if they need to see a doctor, a therapist, or a regular physical health doctor, or if they needed to get a library book, they would be put in a cage like this so that they have no contact, but they can have a little bit of visual association. That's the recent history. That's what I was writing about when my book was published in 2016. That's where we were just a few years ago. But things have changed a lot in the last 2 years. So as you can tell, I go around the country talking about this really depressing stuff. I'm hoping to give you a slightly less depressing talk today about how things are changing. So today, just to give you a snapshot, this is an image a journalist friend of mine took when he went up to Pelican Bay. One of the first times a journalist was allowed to walk down those cells last summer. And Pelican Bay has been converted into a minimum security prison, and the prisoners are painting murals on those solid concrete walls. So you see this, this dark, dreary, remember that cell, no natural light? They've now opened up the doors in the hallways, there's natural light streaming in, and they're painting this beautiful, vivid mural. And there are less than 1,000 people in the state of California in long-term solitary confinement now. And I told you about that prison program I taught in, only associate's degree face-to-face program in the state of California. As of 2019, there are 34 face-to-face associate's degree programs in the state of California, one in every state prison. So we are talking about dramatic change I've seen in the last few years of doing this work. Just to kind of drive it home, what changed? This is one of the central pictures of Pelican Bay that I published in my book to try to give people a sense of the space. Why are prisoners drawing? Well, partly because that gives you a sense of how the prisoners experience it and what they see about it, but also because there were basically no images of the place to be had because journalists weren't allowed inside, and it was incredibly hard to even find an image to put in the book to show people what it looked like. Also, prisoners were only allowed little tiny pencils, so all the images of the place were black and white. You never saw color images coming out. Now, even prisoners in isolation in California are allowed some colored drawing materials, so you start to see colored drawings coming out of the facility. And that kind of matches nicely with this colored mural that these minimum security prisoners are now painting in the place, right? So that's just kind of an image of the dramatic difference we're seeing. And then same with, this is a map, the orange dot is the one face-to-face associate's degree program I used to teach in California, and now we've got this scattering of them all over the states, right? How did we get here? What changed? This is the theme I want to talk about. First, to contextualize these reforms and tell you that solitary confinement and college programs are part of a massive set of changes. So I kind of want to give you that positive overview of the things happening in California and across the country that these reductions in solitary confinement and these increases in education are representative of. And then I'll talk a little about what I think might be going on. Big debates in criminology, right? Our favorite thing is to debate why these things go up and why they go down, but I'll give you my kind of take on how I'm thinking about it. Okay, but first I want to just tell you what's changing, right? Beyond solitary confinement and these education programs, what's the context of change? So I'll talk about 3 categories of changes that have been going on. Changes in prison conditions, which solitary confinement is representative. Changes in sentencing laws, so the way how long people are going to prison for, and also what kinds of punishments they're being sentenced to in the first place. And changes in programming opportunities. So that's education is an example of that. So I just kind of want to give you an overview of all the things that are going on, right? It's not just these 2 stories. I showed you those pictures of the bunk beds stacked 3 high in California. That was representative of incarceration across the US. We had these grossly overcrowded prisons where people were sleeping on floors, sleeping on 3 high bunk beds. And one of the things that's been happening is kind of attention to that, seeing that it doesn't, for all kinds of reasons you can imagine, it doesn't work to run an institution functioning at 167% of capacity. You can't provide services. It's hard to provide health care. It's hard to make sure people are safe when it's that overcrowded. So you can imagine the kinds of legal challenges that have been brought as people were aware of what was happening. And those have resulted in reforms. California's prisons today are hovering around 130% of capacity, way better than 167, right? They're down from a peak of around 167,000 prisoners to more around 120,000. So that's a big improvement. The other thing, of course, is less solitary. So in California, again, it was a piece of the story was litigation, and I'll talk more about this when I explain the change. But the reductions in solitary have come from all kinds of different reform efforts, but today the estimates are, whereas at the peak around 100,000 prisoners in long-term solitary confinement, big reductions all over the country, lots of attention to this issue, lots of states trying to reduce both the number of people and the length of time people are spending in solitary confinement. So a recent report published by Yale suggested in the last few years the nationwide numbers have gone down by 20,000 or more. So those prison conditions issues are really important because 97% or more of people get out of prison, right? I'm gonna start talking about the long sentences we've had, and we have this idea that maybe people spend life in prison. That's really a tiny minority of the overall prison population. And so how we treat people in prison matters because they come home. One of the most interesting and surprising things I found when I started doing research on the use of solitary confinement in California was that every month about 100 people are released directly from long-term solitary confinement into the streets in California. That's why prison conditions matter, because these people come home and they become our neighbors. And we know, imagine what it's like to spend 10 or 15 years alone with no human contact and a fluorescent light on all the time inside a concrete and steel box. And then imagine leaving and going onto the busy streets of San Francisco or Los Angeles and all the things that have changed, right? People talk to me about having never seen a cell phone or a touch screen or a flashing automated walk light, right? And not having had real human contact, right? So that's the prison condition issue matters so much, and I think courts and legislators and citizens have started to pay attention because they realize people are coming home, and if they come home really traumatized, it's really hard to reintegrate. So the next set of changes that are happening are changes in sentencing laws. And again, these have happened at both the state and the federal level, and they've been drastic. A lot of the attention has been to these really long, semi-permanent sentences. But I'll talk a little about some of the things happening in California in particular, which, California has been a leader in many ways, right? Big popular state. We've been a leader in solitary confinement reform and reducing overcrowding. We've also been a leader in having really long prison sentences. And that's some of the reforms that have been happening. So California was not the first, but it was kind of the popularizer of the idea of 3 strikes. People have heard of 3 strikes? Yeah, 3 strikes and you're out, right? So the idea, you get 3 felony convictions and you go to prison for 25 years to life. Long time. Some of those convictions, as we've documented, are pretty minor. Stole some golf clubs, some video cassettes, involved in some minor drug crimes that aren't even considered crimes anymore, right? Like possession of drugs. So one of the things California has been doing over the last few years is really chipping away at that law. Reducing the number of things that count as a felony that could make you eligible for 3 strikes, trying to make that retroactive, so make people who have nonviolent felonies eligible to go up for parole earlier so that they can get out earlier. So that's, this goes with the overcrowding and the conditions issue, right? We have a sense of, okay, can we look at people who maybe don't need to be in prison for 25 years because they weren't that violent in the first place, and they've also, by the time they're 50 or 60, they're really unlikely. We know people age out of crime. They're unlikely to be dangerous to society. Can we look at trying to get them out? Because there's all kinds of benefits institutionally and individually to that. So some of the other, life without parole has become a really popular sentence in the US over the course of the 80s. So the idea that you never get out under any conditions. And there have been huge reforms in California and federally to try to reevaluate whether that's a sentence that makes sense for kids. So the US was one of the biggest users in the world of sentencing people who committed crimes before they turned 18 to life without parole. In the whole world, there's a few hundred people with that sentence, except for the US, where there's 4,000 to 5,000 are the estimates, people with juvenile life without parole sentences. So that's been, again, a really interesting state and federal collaboration. The Supreme Court a few years ago said mandatory juvenile life without parole sentences are unconstitutional. You have to have a really individualized assessment of kids because we know that their brains aren't developed enough to be fully responsible for their actions. I'm nodding. We have one of the world experts on that in the room over here. And California has gone even further, right? So now we're being a progressive leader again and pass laws that extend that say if you were under 25 at the time of your crime, you can petition to go before the parole board and have your case reconsidered. So they're expanding that idea of youth to try to reconsider people who've been in prison 20, 30 years. Do they maybe deserve a chance to get out? And realignment is what's associated with the overcrowding, and that's the state kind of trying to shift people from the state prison systems into much more local facilities. So either jails or, even better, community corrections or halfway house type places. So they've been shifting a lot of money into the counties to decide what to do with lower level criminal issues, rather than shipping people off to places like Pelican Bay, which is on the state's northern border with Oregon. Really hard to visit up there if you have family, hard to maintain connections, and expensive, right? So the idea is we're kind of shifting to try to make criminal justice more local. And then at the federal level, lots of similar things have been happening. The First Step Act, just recently passed, looking at trying to reduce mandatory minimums, kind of like realignment, right? Again, California being a leader, trying to think about how can we shift people out of these high security rural prisons into more local community halfway house contexts. Under the Obama administration, there was a massive clemency project to try to evaluate people, just like nonviolent three-strikers in Clemency, right? Evaluate people who had gone to prison on nonviolent drug convictions for extremely long sentences under laws that no longer apply. Things like crack cocaine, where it used to be a gross disparity. If you had a little bit of crack cocaine, you'd go to prison for a much longer time than if you had a lot of powder cocaine. Congress has tried to fix that. One of the things the Obama administration was doing was saying, can we make it retroactive? Can we look at people who've been in prison for a long time and try to evaluate, give them clemency, get them out? And the administration released about 1,000 people under that evaluation. So those are big changes happening across the country to kind of, in conjunction with these conditions issues, to say, can we reduce overcrowding? Can we reduce the costs? Can we impose less severe restrictions on people who maybe didn't do things that were that serious? And the last set of things is changes in programming. So putting more resources into this population to try to help them be people we want to come home and live next door to us, right? So not just making their conditions less abusive, but actually investing in trying to make them helpful. So one of the big exciting things is restoration of Pell Grants. I mentioned in 1996, Congress passed a law eliminating Pell Grants for anyone who was incarcerated, and often for people who had felony convictions. And they've been kind of slowly inching their way back to thinking about, can we grant prisoners, can we put funding back to help prisoners who are eligible apply and get support for completing college courses? So there's a pilot Pell Grant program. There's a lot of pilot Pell sites in the state of California. And this is helping people get not just associate's degrees, but actually complete a 4-year BA degree. And this is something that was started under the Obama administration, but actually the current presidential administration has been fairly supportive, signing off on the First Step Act and supporting more investment in education for former prisoners. So I was surprised someone didn't. Jared Kushner, right, advisor to the president, his son-in-law, his father was incarcerated when he was in college, and so he's actually a big advocate for supporting these kinds of prison reform issues. So that's kind of happening in the background. And then, as I mentioned, with a lot of these sentencing reforms, one of the things people are thinking about is, okay, can we not just shorten sentences, but can we get people closer to home and in less restrictive environments? So there's kind of getting people, supporting halfway houses, getting them into these kinds of better conditions. That's the positive. All is light. All these great things are happening. And it's, as someone who's been working on these issues for almost 20 years, it's been a really exciting few years. In spite of there being sort of controversial and often depressing things happening at the federal level, at the kind of state and local criminal justice level, I see so much energy and excitement. 2 years ago, I was at a conference with a lot of lawyers who've litigated solitary confinement issues for years, and the mood in the room was just elated. I've never been with lawyers who do prison litigation who are in such a good, because the kinds of reforms we'd seen across the nation around solitary confinement were so heartening and were things that none of us ever expected to see in our lifetime, given the recalcitrance of prisons that we've sort of advocated against and litigated against. So this is an exciting time for people who do this work. And it's really important to think about why, right? Because one of the big issues for someone like me who's a little cynical and has studied this for a long time is, well, can we keep it going, right? How do we keep the momentum going? So I want to kind of switch to thinking a little more about how did we get here and how sustainable is it? So the why, I kind of didn't give you the context, but this is mass incarceration, right? Who's seen a graph of mass? Yeah, it's hard to pick the image you want of mass incarceration. There are so many of these on the internet. Thankfully, when you Google my name, you do not see graphs of mass incarceration, at least. Just the Pelican Bay prison cells. But this is a graph of prison population growth in the United States over the last 50 plus years. And when people talk about mass incarceration, this is what they're talking about. Do I have a clicker? That sometime around the 80s, we go from a really stable population of around 200,000 people in prison in the US. In the 1980s, criminologists were writing about just how stable prison populations were and how interesting it was that with all the things changing socially, they were stable. And right as they started to write about that, you start to see this incredibly steep uptake. Up into the 2000s, where we have a peak of 1.6 million people in prison. If you see the statistics that include jail and supervision, it's way over 2 million, right? This is the highest rate of incarceration anywhere in the world, right? So it's not just the raw numbers of more than 1 million people, it's the fact that the proportion of our population is really high. And it's incredibly racially disproportionate. There are statistics that suggest that 1 in 3 African American men might be incarcerated over the course of their lifetime because it's so racially disproportionate. 1 in 3. So this is kind of what's been happening and why there's been this kind of backtracking, right? We're up here at this peak, and people are starting to say, wow, that's really steep, right? This is a dramatic graph. We functioned for 50-odd years with this incredibly stable system, and then we see this uptick. And criminologists have been, so this, and then the point I'm talking about right here is where we start to, then we start to see reversal in the pattern. It's falling a little bit. So criminologists have been debating what in the world happened in the 1980s since then, right? This is, if you open up criminology or you look at the kind of journals I'm reading all the time, you'll see 101 theories for what happened, right? Was it economics? Was it surplus labor? Was it politics? Was it a fear of crime, a sense of wanting to be tough on crime that got excessive? There are crazy theories. My biases show. There are creative theories about whether changes in abortion laws changed the crime patterns, about whether lead paint was causing crime and then reduced crime. One of the big debates is, did incarceration help, right? We had some higher crime rates in the 80s. Was that the reason we went on this trend? Did incarcerating this many people make the crime rates drop? There's not good evidence that it did, maybe a little, right? And the way I often think about all these explanations is, there's a lot of society. You can't, one explanation is not going to explain why 1.6, 1.7 million people are in prison. And so I think a lot of these explanations actually work together and explain parts of the process, right? Economics matter, politics matter, sentencing, procedural changes to sentencing, like 3 strikes matter, right? The fact that crime rates were rising matter, but they're all pieces of a really complicated puzzle. There's no one easy answer. I always get this question. So what happened? So where am I going? Well, there's not one easy answer to what's happening now that's leading us to this arrow and this change down. And people are just beginning to try to think about it and make sense of it. And that was where I wanted to go with the next piece of the talk, was think about it with you all, to tell you kind of some of the things I'm thinking about from the reforms I know really well that I think have made a difference, and kind of talk through them and whether, is that sustainable? What are the limitations of those? So I'll talk about 3 different things that I see have really mattered in the reforms I've looked at closely. So one thing is oversight and transparency. A second thing is money. Money, right? Makes the world go round. And a third is an interesting combination of international level influences meeting local level kind of power and innovation. So I'll talk about each in turn. Oversight and transparency. This is, I told you one of my favorite stories about studying solitary confinement in California was getting the crazy statistic that we release 100 people a month directly onto the streets. You can imagine all the public policy implications of that. My other favorite story about studying solitary confinement has to do with oversight and transparency. When I started studying Pelican Bay in the early 2000s, people said to me, why are you interested in Pelican Bay? Why do you want to study the worst of the worst, right? These people who've been sent to solitary confinement for so many years. And I said, well, I'm really interested in the kind of most hidden parts of the system and the people who are treated the worst. I'm kind of curious, right? How do we get there? And why is this happening? And maybe if we look at this population and we can kind of understand better why they're there, maybe we'll create some empathy, maybe people will understand that this doesn't seem like such a good policy. This is early 2000s, people said, you're crazy, right? Tough on crime, 3 strikes, it's so juvenile life without parole, all this stuff is so popular. This system isn't gonna change, right? This is why all the advocates were so surprised 2 years ago. And I said, no, I think if people understand what's going on, the system will change. And that's my oversight and transparency pitch, is that's when the system changed. When people started to understand what was happening at Pelican Bay. And when that happened was when the prisoners there got together and organized a massive statewide hunger strike to protest the conditions of their confinement. One of the big things they were objecting to was why they were in isolation. In California, until the reforms, the vast majority of people, the vast majority of those 4,000 people in long-term solitary, were there not because they had done a specific thing wrong, right? You think of, well, either they were crazy violent outside of prison and they got sent to solitary, or they were crazy violent in prison and they got sent to solitary. People get sent to solitary based on internal administrative prison decisions. Judges and juries do not send them there. And in California, they were getting sent there based not on their actions, but their status. So they were being sent there because they had been labeled as gang members. And in California, you got labeled as a gang member based on 3 pieces of evidence in your prison file. Any 3 pieces of evidence that prison administrators put there. The kind of evidence that got you labeled as a gang member included the tattoos you had, things you were reading. George Jackson's book was banned, Soledad Brother. Malcolm X's biography, these kinds of things that were associated with radicalism in prison in particular. Letters you were writing, people you were associating with, anything that you might think of as a First Amendment right outside of prison, exercising those rights in prison might get you labeled a gang member and sent to solitary indefinitely. People didn't know this until those prisoners in Pelican Bay, who were there for those reasons, got together and organized to try to raise awareness around it. So they wrote letters to each other, they planned a hunger strike, they had a list of principles, including this gang status thing, and the conditions that they wanted changed. They sent those letters out to advocates. The letters went back into prisons around the state, and prisoners coordinated, at first in 2012, a 3-week-long hunger strike. And then there was a second hunger strike in which tens of thousands of prisoners across the state refused food for more than a month. This got national and international attention. And this is when things started to change. Because as people started to pay attention, they got some more information. And one of my favorite statistics is, I've been asking the state prison system for years, how many people are in solitary confinement for how long and why, right? Just pretty basic, but this was not data that was being published or was readily available. In fact, they weren't really collecting good data about how long people were spending in solitary confinement. The state told me they count beds, not people, which is representative of how a lot of corrections data is collected. But a journalist, when this hunger strike started getting attention, made a request to the department and said, just tell me today, how many people are in Pelican Bay who've been there more than 5 years, more than 10 years continuously? And she got that snapshot data, and it turned out more than 500 prisoners had been in Pelican Bay in those solitary confinement cells for more than 10 years. That one little statistic published by an NPR reporter changed solitary confinement in the state. That group of prisoners was almost immediately certified as a class. They brought a class action case against the state prison system for the conditions and the time and the lack of review of those long conditions. So that's my favorite story about how oversight really matters. As soon as we knew what was happening, as soon as those prisoners got attention and we got that one statistic, we had enough information to try to make change. And people didn't say, throw away the key, those guys are awful, right? They said the same thing you said when I showed you that picture of a cell. Wait, what? That's how we're treating people, the vast majority of whom come home? So I think this is part of why I do the work I do, because I think these kinds of oversight, asking the questions about the data, getting the data, amplifying the voices of people inside and their experiences is so important to any possibility of change. And it's a similar story with the overcrowding in California. Transparency is a huge part of that story, transparency and public attention. So I show you this picture because it's one of the pictures that the Supreme Court published in their opinion condemning the overcrowding in California state prisons. It was the first time the Supreme Court published a photo in an opinion, because it struck them, right? These images of California prisons that were so grossly overcrowded were so important that they got literally institutionalized in the law. So it's a, this is transparency, right? We literally see a picture of the prison, and for the first time the Supreme Court publishes a photo because they were so upset by what they were seeing with the overcrowding in the state, and that led to all of these, many of the reforms I'm talking about are tied to this case. The original case was Plata v. Schwarzenegger. It started out as a case about inadequate health care in the state. Bunch of lawyers at the prison law office, where I worked right after college when they first started looking into these questions about healthcare in the state and the fact that it was inadequate, started gathering evidence about how prisoners were dying of things like abscessed teeth because they couldn't get them to a dentist fast enough. And they were, the lawyers at first just wanted better health care, right? And the state wasn't really objecting. They were saying, yeah, we don't have enough money, right? When we're operating at 67% of capacity, please sue us, and maybe the state will give us more money to actually get health care to these people. And so they were kind of working together and figuring this out. But as the case went on, it became clear that you couldn't get enough doctors into our rural prisons all over the state to serve this population. And that's how we ended up with this, what became known as the overcrowding case, with judges in California saying, well, the only way to solve this problem is to figure out how to let a lot of people out or get them into more local facilities, so reduce the state prison population. And that's how we get to this now famous Plata v. Brown, one of the only prison conditions cases to go to the Supreme Court in the past few decades, and then we get the images, and that's, the oversight that case brought to the prison system across the country really mobilized the reform. Those are two of my favorite oversight and transparency, or things that are themes of my research, because I think they really are kind of the linchpins to trying to change the system. And it's also a place where when you hear about these things and you feel sort of defeated, often students say to me, how do you do this work without getting depressed? And I say, well, because you're shedding light on a place no one sees. So it's really interesting, and just the act of observing is important, right? So when people feel sort of helpless, I think it's really one of the things you as citizens can do is just pay attention. That matters, right? When hundreds of thousands of people are paying attention, that's when the abuses become harder and harder to enact. Okay. Oversight and transparency. I did my favorite one first. But one of the other things that I think is one piece of understanding reforms is money. And when I say money, I mean these kinds of practices are incredibly expensive, and the benefits haven't panned out the way people hoped. So, as one example, it costs about $90,000 per person per year to keep someone in one of those long-term solitary confinement cells at Pelican Bay. That's about twice the cost of keeping someone in the general population prison in the state of California, and about 3 to 4 times the cost of sending someone to college, which seems potentially more productive, right? And it turns out, one of the things people often ask me about solitary is, well, does it work? Did it reduce violence? Do people come out more reformed? Does it reduce recidivism? And I say, well, turns out very few people have looked at that even. See previous about lack of data. And the people that have been able to get data and look at it, the results are really mixed and inconclusive. There is no dramatic impact of long-term solitary confinement on any of the things we might hope that's ever been documented. And that's kind of true of our broader prison system also. Like I said, there's not a really tight connection between rates of crime and rates of incarceration. And so as more and more studies have come out about this, there's been more and more questions about whether this massive investment in keeping 1.6 million people in prison is paying off socially. And I think that's led to a lot of change. As we have more information, we say, it seems like a really expensive investment that's taking away from other things, and it's not really working. So I love to show this when I teach. This is just a budget in California to show you that we spend roughly the same amount on higher education in the state as we do on prisons. That wasn't always true. We've shifted, as the prisons got bigger and more expensive, we shifted more money into them. But it's just to show you that, I I think of this as a pulse on our values, right? This is a kind of quick way of measuring, and we're saying, well, we invest the same amount in incarceration as we do in education. And that kind of dialogue, I think, has started to raise questions for people as they look more closely at these kind of budgets. So there's a great book by a professor at UC Hastings, Hadar Avram, and Cheap on Crime, I think, just kind of frames this, right? She's saying, okay, as there's more economic pressures as we go through a recession, she says, we get cheap on crime. We start figuring out how to spend less money on it. And sometimes some reforms come out of that. Not always good, right? In case you can't tell, I think providing Pell Grants to people in prison makes a lot of sense in terms of giving them access to education. So we don't want to cut all funding. But one of the great things about providing Pell Grants to prisoners is that we're not funding the prison system, right? We're funding the individuals and trying to get them into the education system. So I think of that more as money going to education rather than money going to corrections. And those are the kinds of dialogues we're starting to see that are happening. Okay, so the last kind of theme I want to talk about is the role of international influence kind of meeting local level reformers. So one of the things I said is that I am talking so much about California where reforms are happening, that California is an influencer, right? We kind of amplified 3 strikes. We led the way in reducing solitary confinement. So one of the really important things to understand about criminal justice is that it is fundamentally local, right? We think of the federal prison system and Obama's Clemency Initiative or the First Step Act. There's fewer people in federal prison across the US than there are in prison in California or Texas, two of the biggest, right? So the state prison systems make up the vast majority of incarceration. Most criminal justice funding is at the state and local level. Things like policing, most criminal laws, right? All of that stuff happens at the state or even the more local level. And so that's where change is going to happen also. But ironically, there's also been a lot of attention to international practices. As we've asked these questions about, does this work? Is this financially feasible? Are people safe in these places? Are we doing bad things to people who are coming home and becoming our neighbors? People have started to look around, not just to neighboring states, but to other countries to see what best practices are. And I think that's played a role at the local level, ironically, right? So local state officials or even leaders of jails are saying, what can I do to try to make my system better? How can I use my money more efficiently? And they're looking internationally. And that's just an interesting, I think, place to think about. And I saw this first in the hunger strikes, where when those prisoners at Pelican Bay got together and protested the conditions, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture started paying attention, and he was like, wait, California does what? But the norm in international law is that more than 15 days in long-term solitary confinement could constitute at least what international law calls cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, if not torture. And the Pelican Bay, as the UN Special Rapporteur came to California, and he was very critical of the conditions at Pelican Bay, and as he started paying more attention to those things, the United Nations actually codified much more clear policies laying out that more than 15 days in these kinds of conditions can readily, can rise to the level of torture. So that that played a role. I think some more progressive states like California and Washington, where I've done some research, were uncomfortable with their policies violating international norms. Even if that's not necessarily codified in our Constitution, there's a sense of shame around getting that kind of attention. So that's playing a role. But also the good things Europe is doing have played a really important role. Anybody seen this? Anyone seen the Michael Moore movie where he goes to the prison in Norway, Halden, that looks like an IKEA kind of warehouse, and talks about how they've got these violent prisoners who've committed murder, and they have them in these really open spaces where they're, the great scene is they're cooking dinner together and they have these big knives, and Michael Moore sort of, that great scene. I often show this in my classes, but this is representative, right? Michael Moore has his finger on the pulse of some pop culture issues. There's been all kinds of attention to what Northern Europe in particular is doing, how they're able to have much less restrictive prison conditions and much better outcomes, right? They have lower recidivism rates, they have less violence in their prisons. People generally do better there. And so these are pictures I took. I spent the last few summers in Denmark looking at their prisons and their prison culture. I got depressed about solitary confinement in the United States. And I said, how can I stop spending my time in places like Pelican Bay, and how can I spend it somewhere more interesting and uplifting? And so with 2 colleagues actually who are alums of UCI, I spent 2 summers interviewing prisoners and staff in Denmark, just trying to understand, how does this work? How do you think about the prisons in this country? How is it different from how we think about it? Can we learn anything from you? And I wasn't the only one. Lots of initiatives have started to try to take correctional officers from the United States to Europe to say, look, this is a different way of thinking about things. And a few states have even implemented new models. So South Dakota has gotten, or North Dakota, and I think it's North Dakota, the worst with the Dakota. I hope no one is from the Dakotas. Has sent a team of correctional officers over to Northern Europe to visit their prisons, brought them back, and actually used that to try to reduce their use of long-term solitary confinement, to say, they actually have these person-to-person dialogues about what works in that system and whether it can be implemented there. And you can see some of the things that are different. Same things you saw in the Michael Moore film. Prisoners, the central principle in these prisons that are lauded as so progressive is normalization. The idea that life in prison should be as much as possible like life outside of prison, because they acknowledge what we're just starting to realize: everyone comes home. So the more you can make prison life like not prison life, the easier the adjustment will be. So that's the justification for things like this kitchen in a prison, right? It does look like a kitchen in an IKEA showroom. With the knives, and prisoners cook their own meals, do their own laundry. Generally, this is, family visiting is considered really important because you have human contact and families on the outside. And so one of the things Denmark has done is worked with Lego, I love this, who's given them a lot of grants to design these really child-friendly places in prisons where children and family can come visit and have a really nice time on a playground that feels like a playground you might see outside of the prison, and maintain those normal family relationships. Most prisons in Scandinavia are what are called open prisons. So this looks like a college campus, right? This image up here. So that's a prison where there's no fence around it at all. There happens to be this just sort of checkpoint with the black and white stripes that you drive through. And prisoners can go work jobs in the community or go to school in the community, and then they come back at night to the prison and sleep there. So these kinds of ideas, people are kind of fascinated. They're like, this works? And one thing people often say to me, but people in the US are so much more violent, and the people in prison are way tougher to deal with. And I say, well, Denmark and Norway and Sweden have some of the lowest incarceration rates in the world, which means you have to really mess up to get into one of these prisons. The only people they're sending to prison are the seriously, seriously violent ones who've committed the things we think of as rape or murder, right? The most serious crimes on the books are the ones who end up in these facilities. So we're not talking about low-level prisoners in these places. And the other thing people often say to me is, well, but they're really homogenous societies, right? The US is so diverse. How can you think that we could do what they're doing, right? They have a shared set of values that are driving them, and so it's much easier to be gentle with those people and to not have these fear of strangers. And I say, well, Norway, Scandinavia, Denmark have had problems with immigration for a long time. And even when I first visited a prison in Denmark in 2012, long before the migration crisis in Europe, I was struck that it didn't look, in terms of racial demographics, unlike a prison in the US. I was surprised by how many non-white prisoners there were. And this has been true in Scandinavia for years, that the people who end up in prison are often non-citizens or first-generation immigrants, not actually Scandinavian natives. Now, this is depressing on one end, right? But on the flip side, that means that they figured out how to treat people who don't look like them okay, and they're still thinking about how to integrate them into their society. It's a little less true post-migration crisis in Europe, but I'm trying to stay positive today. But that's, I think, seeing these images, right? Michael Moore, the kinds of work criminologists are starting to do to look at these places and see what they're doing, I think is just shifting people's mindset to say, wow, someone else is doing something. They're getting better outcomes than we are. Is there anything we can learn? Of course their society is different, and we have to take that into account, but maybe there are some things to learn. Some of the things I think we can learn, their prison staff are trained for 3 years at a time, usually. So training to become a correctional officer is 3 years. It's a professional, it's a profession, right? And they treat it that way, and they educate them, and they give them the resources they need to manage difficult populations. And so prison officers are not afraid to walk into these units and work with these prisoners the way many are in the US, and they feel like they have the resources they need to manage difficult situations. And I think that's a place that lots of, the US prison officials who go visit Scandinavia or Northern Europe, that's one of the things they're seeing is, oh, maybe we could train our officers better. Usually a few weeks. I I think it's, 3 weeks to 2 months, depending on the state. Yeah, good point comparison. Yeah. So it's a really different investment in the staff running these facilities. Really lower rates, right? I talked about overcrowding. We have much better staff-prisoner ratios in these facilities also. One of the interesting things I've written about also that I think is really important in places like Denmark is that I've called it, with the colleagues I've done the work with, room for error, right? They acknowledge that you can't get it perfect, right? Once in a while, someone's going to escape. Once in a while, someone's going to commit another crime, and we accept it. We don't react to that one instance, right, the 1 in 100, and change all our policies. And I think we have a lot to learn from that in the United States also, because we have a tendency to say, oh my God, this one terrible thing happened. Let's react to it, like Jessica's laws around sex offenses, or 3 strikes, right, around someone who committed a violent crime after they'd been released from prison. But we need to think about the average, not the outlier, because when we design policies for the outliers, we get this kind of over-incarceration. That's just one thing I've learned, right? But I think it's really interesting to see that it's not just academics, it's folks on the ground and corrections in the US saying, can we do this better? And really looking around to see what other creative models work. And that's happened in conjunction with local levels, right? That's wardens at individual prisons or secretaries of corrections in states saying, hey, I want to go over to Europe and see what they're doing and see if there's anything I can learn. And so that's kind of, I think, a really interesting and exciting model for reform that's potentially sustainable. Okay, so I'm getting close to wrapping up. This leaves us with the question, is the system transformed? So these are, again, another image of those therapeutic treatment modules, otherwise known as cages in California, where prisoners in isolation used to go if they were going to see a doctor, if they were going to read a legal textbook. And this is what Washington State has replaced those with. So this is another, I think, really powerful image of reform. These are, Washington State calls them programming chairs. So they look kind of like a desk in a classroom. They're kind of creatively designed. They're made so that prisoners can be kind of locked into them, and their legs and even their hands can be handcuffed to the desk if they need to be. So they're not kind of a free. This is not Scandinavia. There are no knives in this classroom. But this is a dramatic difference from these cages, right? Washington is saying, no, we want people to be able to look each other in the eye. They're putting these desks in the common areas in their isolation units. They're saying we want them to be visible to everyone, and we want people in classroom spaces communicating as many hours a day as possible, not locked in that 8 by 10 foot cell that's like a wheelchair accessible bathroom stall, right? We want, again, it's a first step towards normalization, like Scandinavia. We want to try to make life as normal as possible, even for people who might be dangerous. So this is really exciting transformations that are happening. And the question is, how sustainable are they and how big is it, right? And I take you back to the mass incarceration chart and remind you that we're still right here. And we used to be right here, right? So all the great things I've talked about have been kind of like little chips off the iceberg of mass incarceration. We aren't doing anything that's getting at the central issue, I think. So we're taking steps in the right direction, but it's really important to not step back, pat ourselves on the back, and celebrate yet. And I think the steps are also often just that. They're kind of shaving off the surface, and there's limits to how much we can shave off the surface without thinking really creatively about stuff like, what is Europe doing, and can we learn something from it? So I want to talk a little about those, kind of go back to the reform mechanisms I highlighted and talk a little about the limits, so I don't end on a totally positive note. So oversight and transparency remain limited, right? The work that was done in California in particular was huge to literally bring light into places like Pelican Bay. But it's not, it hasn't been perfect. One of the things that's happening in California, I showed you the picture of Pelican Bay. It's been opened up. There are those murals. It's now a minimum security prison. The state has not eliminated long-term solitary confinement. And in fact, they've done a lot of creative things to move people into places that are less visible, to relabel the kinds of conditions they're in. But a lot of those 500 prisoners who were the members of the class, the hunger strikers who were moved out of Pelican Bay, I get lots of letters from those folks saying, I'm back in isolation in another place in another prison that's not part of the lawsuit, right? So there's not the oversight and there's not the, so it is to say, paying attention is really important. We have to keep paying attention, right? We can't just say, oh, we got it, we fixed it. These are really powerful institutions with a lot of people invested in them running the way they've been running. And so it's not enough to pay attention for a year or two. It has to be kind of institutionalized in the way we think about these facilities. One of the reasons we have to institutionalize it, thinking about money, is that so many people are so invested in these places. So one of the other things I'm often interested in talking about when I talk about reform and how our prisons work is that private companies have really increased in incarceration. And I'm not talking about private prisons. Those get all the attention, right? That there's this Corrections Corporation of America and they run these private prisons. That's less than 10% of the prison population in the US. It's a way bigger problem with immigration detention, but it's still, when we think about those 1.6 million people in prison, the vast majority of them are in publicly run facilities. But private companies are providing all of the services they're receiving, and no one is paying attention to the financial interests of those private companies. There are private companies providing healthcare. There are private companies providing all telecommunication services. There are private companies providing food. And there have been massive problems with those companies providing inadequate services and also lobbying to make sure those prisons stay full so that they continue to maintain their incredibly high profit margins. And so that's a place where I think we need to pay attention, right? And we need to pay attention oversight and to the money. Who's invested and where's the money going? So this is an example. There's been a lot of advocacy over the last few years to try to reduce the really high rates that prisoners pay to these private companies to make phone calls from prisons. And a lot of, especially local jails, have said, we're not gonna make those extortionary contracts anymore where prisoners pay $15 for a 5-minute phone call to talk to their family. The FCC has worked to regulate that a little bit, and the prison phone companies got worried that their profit margins were gonna go down, and so they started signing contracts with jails to mandate video visitation instead of in-person visitation. Sounds like a good idea if you can't go to see your loved one because they're hours away, but it's not a good idea if you can and you can no longer see them in person and you have to pay for the video the way you used to have to pay for the phone call. So that's an example of the ways money and lack of oversight are kind of interacting to resist reform. And it is the First Step Act, the federal act that was passed last year, did some great things, but there was a lot of investment from these private companies in making sure that they had a stake in the shifting norms and values that the act was codifying. And so companies that provide GPS ankle monitor surveillance, which is, we're trying to keep people out of prison and put them on ankle surveillance. Well, there's a lot of companies invested in trying to make sure they profit off of that and maximizing that. So just something to pay attention to. And the last thing is just to say, I don't want you to come away from this thinking Northern Europe and Scandinavia are perfect. Some of my work in Denmark has been looking at how they have copied the US model and tried to build supermaxes to impose long-term solitary confinement. So this is an image of an exercise yard, prettier than the exercise yards in California. There's some color, there's some beautiful textures on the wall designed by Danish Scandinavian textile makers. But that is an isolation yard. The people you see on the yard are staff, those aren't, right? So that's a yard for people in long-term solitary confinement in Denmark because 2 years ago they opened a supermax that looks not unlike an American supermax. So it's just to say we have to pay attention, and none of this is sort of perfect and on a clear downward trajectory of mass incarceration. So that is it, and I look forward to your questions. Yeah. Oh, you get a mic.
Cool. I know that you mentioned a little bit of the immigration detentions as opposed to the regular jails and prisons. Have you seen any kind of changes in that as well, based on the changes that are here?
You're chipping away at my attempt to make this talk positive.
Wondering.
I know, I opened the door, but no. Immigration detention is a little bit of a nightmare. I said incarceration, only 10% is privatized. The vast majority of immigration detention is privatized, and those private companies. And it's an important lens into the fact that we can't really separate mass incarceration from immigration detention, because those private companies that have tried to get a handle on, have tried to sort of nose their way into running state prison facilities have done a much better job getting contracts to run immigration detention facilities. And so they're very powerful in that industry. There's something called a detention bed mandate that these companies lobbied for to make sure there's a minimum number of people in immigration detention at any time to make sure that they're able to profit off of these facilities they're running. And that's just the beginning of the ways that economics and privatization are playing a role in immigration detention. So when we think about, family separation or the really troubling things that we've seen happening on the news around immigration, we also have to think about the people who are invested in profiting off of that. And it's not the Border Patrol agents necessarily, it's these companies that have lobbied really hard to build up the system to what it is. And the phone companies that I talked about, they provide services in immigration detention, right? So the service providers for these secure confinement facilities are doing, the same work in prisons or in immigration detention. If you think about the law, that's really disturbing, because as you can tell, I'm an advocate for treating prisoners humanely, but at least there was a process by which prisoners were convicted of violating a law. Immigration detainees, by definition, are not people who have violated our laws. They have not been labeled criminals. And we are using the exact same service providers and putting them in the exact same conditions. And I think that's an important thing to kind of look at and pay attention to. Yeah.
In terms of the Scandinavian prisons, do they have designations like they do here, like level 1, level 2, for security and stuff like that? And also, I'm just curious in terms of how society as a whole views punitive measures and punishment.
Yeah.
Because the fact that they spend so much time, training their officers, and it's actually thought of as because a lot of times, I know correctional officers, and in jail too, you get punished by having to deal with a prison population. So it's looked down at like you're being punished when you deal with guys that are, incarcerated people that are incarcerated. So it's like a whole different way of looking at, just your position in society, what you do as a correctional officer. So I guess.
Yeah, so there are two questions there. Sort of how do they think about security and the culture of staff? Yeah. It is true, and my work is moving more and more towards looking at the impacts of these conditions on staff, which I think is another really interesting research question. And it is true, it is not a prestigious job in Denmark either to be a prison officer. I've ironically gotten to be, in my work, I've gotten to be friends with prison officers in the U.S. but in Denmark it's easier actually, in part because we've had these interesting conversations because there's the class barrier or the prestige barrier in the U.S. that would keep a professor from being friends with a correctional officer doesn't quite exist in Denmark because there's these language issues and there's the culture, right? And so that highlights the fact, I've had literal conversations with correctional officers there. They have never talked to a professor before because there is a class issue, and they are people who aren't getting a college degree. They're getting a 3-year training in being a correctional officer instead. And so it's not to say that those issues don't exist, which I think is really important because a prison is a prison, right? I think that sometimes gets lost in the looking and lauding Scandinavia, is that no, these are still institutions with problems of class and race in particular, but they're doing a better job with those problems. So that's one interesting thing I'll say about staff. And then the other thing in terms of security, they have security levels much like we do, and in fact, with the migration crisis in Europe, they have grossly disproportionate immigrant populations in higher and higher security levels. So when you look at solitary confinement rates in Denmark, it's now more than half immigrants as opposed to citizens. And that's true in the US also, right? Our solitary confinement use is even more racially disproportionate than our prison use. So that's part of the story. So again, not perfect. But in solitary confinement, people can still talk to and see their families. One of my favorite stories in Denmark, I interviewed one of the guys who'd been in solitary confinement for the longest, and I was finishing up another interview with someone in general population, and a prison officer came up to me and he said, "Can you hurry up because the guy in isolation made you crepes?" And I was like, Danish people have really great senses of humor. And I was like, "That's hilarious. I'm still finishing this interview." And he was like, no, I'm not kidding. He made you crepes, and they're getting cold. Because the guy in isolation has access to a kitchen an hour a day, and they let him make crepes when he made his dinner, and he brought them to the interview we had together, right? So that is a very different, he's still in isolation 23 hours a day, but we had crepes together, which is unimaginable in the US.
So being mindful of your time, we have one more question.
On your slide that showed the significant increase in prison populations, Governor Brown actually takes some ownership of California's contribution to that for the first part of it, because he signed California's determinate sentencing laws, moving away from indeterminate sentencing. So in the second term, he said he was particularly focused on trying to do what he could to reverse that. So obviously he was there on the home and plot suit.
Yeah.
But I'm interested, when you talked about your three, what changed, you talked about changes in programming opportunities too. And so he also shepherded Proposition 57, which was designed to further reduce part of the prison population by providing enhanced sentencing credits for rehabilitative programs.
Both sentencing and programming. Yeah.
If you have thoughts on that, in terms of on just your impression of 47, and if it offers a potential to further not only the reduction in the prison population, but enhancing some rehabilitative opportunities and stuff. You have thoughts on that?
Absolutely, and I think, if you think about my breakdown of conditions, sentencing, and programming, when those things are working together, that's best of all, right? Those are three fundamental aspects of the system that have been broken to my analysis, and if we can pass legislation that both reduces sentences, provides resources to help people reintegrate, to normalize a la Northern Europe, that's great. My cynical take is a lot of that stuff really is just chipping at the iceberg, right? If we're focusing on as California has done, what they call the triple nons, the non-violent, non-serious offenders, then we're left still with all these guys who are, way more than we had in prison in 1970, but maybe did some serious things. So I think, Prop 57 is great for providing kind of the first step, and we have to think about how to expand that.
So with that, thank you all for coming, and thank you for your amazing work. I should mention Keramet and Val are leading a big effort here at UCI to actually provide a bachelor's degree in the California state prisons, and so it's a really amazing task, and kudos to everybody who works so hard. So thank you.
Thanks, Nancy.